brain is an important organ. In fact, according to the brain, it's the most important organ of the human body. It is arguably the most sophisticated tool in the universe, so advanced that it allows us to unveil its secrets, though it can also make you look everywhere for the keys that you're holding in your hands right now. But at any rate, the brain is the most important organ in the universe. In the conclusion of What is Philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari discuss the relation between thoughts and neurological processes. They argue that philosophy, art, and science, which are the three fundamental modes of thinking, cannot be explained in terms of the materiality of the brain. They say, it seems difficult to treat philosophy, art, and even science as mental objects, simple assemblages of neurons in the objectified brain. Thought, even in the form it actively assumes in science, does not depend upon a brain made up of organic connections and integrations. If we are to understand what the brain is, we must study first and foremost what it does, and what it does is to produce thoughts. Thoughts are not primarily physical by nature, even if they relate somehow to the physical brain, but rather thoughts are primarily opponents to chaos. As Deleuze and Guattari say, chaos has three daughters depending on the plane that cuts through it. These are the coids, art, science, and philosophy, as forms of thought or creation. We call coids the realities produced on the planes that cut through the chaos in different ways. The brain is the junction, not the unity, of the three planes. So the study of the brain from Deleuze and Guattari's perspective must begin with the study of how our thoughts originate in and resist to chaos. So in this video we're going to study what they mean by this, what the three planes are and how they intersect, with the hope of understanding once and for all why the brain surpasses all the other organs of the body, because it is, after all, the most important organ in the universe.
I strongly believe that learning is one of the most rewarding things we can do in life. The ability to explore new ideas and make connections is what drives intellectual growth and reveals us our passions, our lifelong vocations. A great learning method is key to achieve this, and that's why I'm excited to share today's sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant has a vast array of courses from foundation and advanced mathematics, science, programming, and AI, all designed to make complex ideas click through interactive problem solving. The mind-bending math course, which is all about infinity, is really quite fascinating. Brilliant's hands-on approach is not just engaging, it's been proven to be 6 times more efficient than passively watching lectures. And the best part, you can learn in just a few minutes a day, at your own pace, from anywhere on your phone. If you're someone who loves learning and wants to sharpen your problem-solving skills and develop a solid scientific and logical intuition, you can try Brilliant for free for 30 days at brilliant.org/DeleuzePhilosophy. And if you decide to keep going, you'll get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thank you very much to Brilliant for sponsoring this video.
What is Philosophy was published in 1991. It is the last book that Deleuze and Guattari wrote together. It is, in a sense, their philosophical testament, their ultimate insight on a question that is, perhaps, the ultimate philosophical question, namely, what does it mean to think? In the first lines of the conclusion, they say, "We require just a little order to protect us from chaos. Nothing is more distressing than a thought that escapes itself, than ideas that fly off, that disappear hardly formed, already eroded by forgetfulness, or precipitated into others that we no longer master. Thought is incredibly volatile. Most of it is made of passing memories, recognitions, or feelings. But this volatility is stabilized by these vital thoughts that are found in philosophy, science, and art. As they say, each of them defines a specific plane, and the book itself, What is Philosophy, is structured to show how these planes are constituted. If we look at the structure of the book, we see that the first part discusses several aspects of the concept, its origin and nature, its history, and how concept creation defines philosophy. The second part, on the other hand, discusses the relation between philosophy and science, defined as our ability to describe observable phenomena, and philosophy and art, defined most generally as our capacity for sensation. Let's first examine the nature of concepts. Contrary to what we usually think, philosophy's primary task is not to contemplate, explain, or communicate about the world. It is defined by what it does. They say, philosophy is the art of forming, inventing, and fabricating concepts. But concepts are not impersonal descriptions of the world. They are creations. Concepts are not waiting for us ready-made like heavenly bodies. There is no heaven for concepts. They must be invented, fabricated, or rather created, and would be nothing without their creator's signature. This is to say that each concept has a structure and an origin of its own. From the point of view of structure, a concept is made of specific components. So for example, the concept of other has three inseparable components: possible world, existing face, and real language or speech. All concepts are made of specific components. But from the point of view of its history, a concept appears in a specific time and place, which determines the components it relates together. Philosophy itself, as a discipline, created conceptual thinking in reaction to older ways of thinking. So Deleuze and Guattari say, the difference between the sage and the philosopher would not be merely one of degree, as on a scale. The old Oriental sage thinks perhaps in figures, whereas the philosopher invents and thinks the concept. Wisdom has changed a great deal. But this means that philosophy has a history of its own, the history of concepts. In this sense, it has its own specific drama, its own philosophical personas, as Deleuze and Guattari say, which define which component matter for conceptual thinking at a given time. These personas do not represent psychological traits, but rather movements of thought itself, the life of the concept. And like all characters, they have enemies as well. In the same way that Plato had the sophists as enemies, modern thinkers have enemies like marketers, designers, or advertisers who claim to create concepts as well. So Deleuze and Guattari say, with some irony, the simulacrum, the simulation of a packet of noodles, has become the true concept, and the one who packages the product, commodity, or work of art has become the philosopher, conceptual persona, or artist. In this sense, the true philosophical concept is opposed to marketing devices, advertisement, to private opinions, and to whatever constitutes the dominant doxa of a given era. So far we have seen that concepts have an origin, a structure, a history, and even enemies. But concepts fundamentally imply the possibility to think, which means that there is something beyond or beneath concepts, which counts as a pre-philosophical ground that simultaneously enables and contains all concepts. This is what Deleuze and Guattari call the plane of immanence. While concepts are fragmentary, finite totalities with distinct components, the plane of immanence is the continuous, infinite milieu through which they move and resonate. The relationship is strictly correlative, but distinct. Concepts occupy, populate, and traverse the plane without dividing it, while the plane provides the consistency that holds concepts together, despite their irregular contours. Deleuze and Guattari say, the plane of immanence is not a concept that is or can be thought, but rather the image of thought, the image thought gives itself of what it means to think, to make use of thought, to find one's bearings in thought. It is not a method, since every method is concerned with concepts and presupposes such an image. Neither is it a stage of knowledge on the brain and its functioning, since thought, here, is not related to the slow brain as to the scientifically determinable state of affairs in which, whatever its use and orientation, thought is only brought about. Nor is it opinions held about thought, about its forms, ends, and means, at a particular moment. Rather, the plane of immanence as an image of thought is what makes particular thoughts possible in the first place. Every great philosopher lays out a new plane of immanence. But the ultimate plane, according to them, is found in Spinoza, who they call the Prince of Philosophers, because he never compromised with transcendence and hunted it down everywhere. While there are many concepts, there is only one plane of immanence. This bipartition between the concept and the plane of immanence constitutes the essential foundation of the philosophical activity, that is, the creation of concepts. It is both what enables philosophy as the creation of concepts, but also what philosophy strives to articulate, since the plane of immanence is what makes thought possible. However, to think cannot be reduced simply to immanence or to the exercise of philosophy. There have to be other components that have a somewhat different role in how thought works. So in part 2 of the book, they compare this conceptual form of thinking with science on the one hand and with art. We're going to examine how they oppose science and philosophy in the next part. While philosophy produces concepts, science produces functions. Science is not opposed to philosophy, but rather it defines another plane of thought, another way of thinking. According to Deleuze and Guattari, there are three principal differences between science and philosophy. The first one concerns their distinctive attitudes towards chaos. They say, Philosophy wants to know how to retain infinite speeds while gaining consistency, by giving the virtual a consistency specific to it. Science approaches chaos in a completely different, almost opposite way. It relinquishes the infinite speed, in order to gain a reference able to actualize the virtual. As a result, where philosophy develops a plane of immanence, science develops a plane of reference, on which functions can do their work. The second difference concerns how concepts and functions handle variables. Science requires independent variables in the function, while philosophy seeks inseparable variations in the concept. The third major difference involves the mode of enunciation. Where philosophy used personas, science uses partial observers. From all this, the consequence is that science and philosophy do ultimately very different things. Deleuze and Guattari say, it could be said that science and philosophy take opposed paths, because philosophical concepts have events for consistency, whereas scientific functions have states of affairs or mixtures for reference. Through concepts, philosophy continually extracts a consistent event from the state of affairs, a smile without a cat, as it were. Whereas through functions, science continually actualizes the event in a state of affairs, thing, or body that can be referred to. Despite these fundamental differences, Deleuze and Guattari state that science and philosophy can maintain complementary approaches to knowledge, but none can be reduced to the other. Science describes states of affairs which are defined as follows. States of affairs leave the virtual chaos on conditions constituted by the limit, reference. They are actualities, even though they may not yet be bodies or even things, units, or sets. They are masses of independent variables, particles' trajectories, or signs' speeds. They are mixtures. By contrast, philosophy defines the plane of immanence as the study of events. They say, the event is not the state of affairs, it is actualized in a state of affairs, in a body, in a lived. But it has a shadowy and secret part that is continually subtracted from, or added to, its actualization. In contrast with the state of affairs, it neither begins nor ends, but has gained or kept the infinite movement to which it gives consistency. It is the virtual that is distinct from the actual, but a virtual that is no longer chaotic, that has become consistent or real on the plane of immanence that wrests it from the chaos. It is a virtual that is real without being actual, ideal without being abstract. While states of affairs exist as a time between two instants, or as times between many instants, events exist in what the authors call meanwhile. It is no longer time that exists between two instants, they say. It is the event that is a meanwhile, un entretemps. The meanwhile is not part of the eternal, but neither is it part of time. It belongs to becoming. The meanwhile, the event, is always a dead time. It is there where nothing takes place, an infinite awaiting that is already infinitely past, awaiting and reserve. This dead time does not come after what happens, it coexists with the instant or time of the accident, but as the immensity of the empty time in which we see it as still to come and as having already happened, in the strange indifference of an intellectual intuition. In this sense, science is said to study actuality, while philosophy studies the virtual, becoming, and the two planes that they form consist in the propositions that we find in each of them. But we have seen that the brain is the relation between planes. So what is the relation between the virtual plane of immanence of philosophy and the actual plane of reference of science? Deleuze and Guattari say the following. From virtuals we descend to actual states of affairs, and from states of affairs we ascend to virtuals, without being able to isolate one from the other. But we do not ascend and descend in this way on the same line. Actualization and counter-effectuation are not two segments of the same line, but rather different lines. These lines are inseparable but independent, each complete in itself, with philosophy speaking of science only by allusion, and science speaking of philosophy only as a cloud. The role of the virtual is to provide new keys to grasp the actual, and it is in this sense that philosophy must, as Bergson says, find the particular metaphysics that science needs at a given time. So, for example, in an interview, Deleuze says the following. I feel I am Bergsonian when Bergson says that modern science hasn't found its metaphysics, the metaphysics it would need. It is this metaphysics that interests me. Science, on the other hand, can use this metaphysics to define new axiomatic properties and variables that it can observe. But what about the third chaoid, the third plane, which is that of art and aesthetic experience? This is the topic of our next section. It is only in chapter 7 of What is Philosophy that Deleuze and Guattari finally describe the last plane that makes thought possible, and that is the plane that produces art, and that is also produced by it. It's called the plane of composition. In order to describe the plane of composition, Deleuze and Guattari here again refer to what it does, and they say, art preserves, and it is the only thing in the world that is preserved. What is preserved, the thing or the work of art, is a block of sensations, that is to say, a compound of percepts and affects. In this sense, the plane of composition is not raw perceptions and sensations, which are relative to either the author of a work of art or to the perspective of an observer. It is rather the being of sensations and perceptions, what they are in themselves, which Deleuze and Guattari define as percepts and affects. They say, percepts are no longer perceptions, they are independent of the state of those who experience them. Affects are no longer feelings or affections, they go beyond the strength of those who undergo them. Sensations, percepts, and affects are beings whose validity lies in themselves and exceeds any lived. They could be said to exist in the absence of man because man, as he is caught in stone, on the canvas, or by words, is himself a compound of percepts and affects. The work of art is a being of sensation and nothing else. It exists in itself. So percepts and affects do not depend on the artist or the viewer, not even on the materiality of the work of art, but it is rather the eternal aspect of sensation and perception. They say, what is preserved by right is not the material, which constitutes only the de facto condition, but insofar as this condition is satisfied, that is, that canvas, color, or stone does not crumble into dust, it is the percept or affect that is preserved in itself. Even if the material lasts for only a few seconds, it will give sensation the power to exist and be preserved in itself, in the eternity that coexists with this short duration. In this sense, matter and sensation become mutually inclusive in a relation that is called expressive, which means that particular sensations and perceptions express percepts and affects, which in turn exist eternally but not independently of their particular expressions. Deleuze and Guattari say, sensation is not realized in the material without the material passing completely into the sensation. This reciprocal relationship generates what they call the being of sensation, which emerges as the interface between material and immaterial forces. But in what sense does sensation imply a plane of composition? Deleuze and Guattari explain that works of art have three components: flesh figure, that is the sensory material that constitutes the primary element of sensation, and then house framework, that is the structural organization that allows sensation to stand independently. And finally, universe cosmos, which is the infinite field of forces that extends beyond the structured form. Here we find a new version of Deleuze's own logic of sensation, which he had developed in his book Bacon, Logic of Sensation, about painting. We have studied this logic in a previous video, which I'll link on top of the screen if you want to go more in depth on this topic. But the general model is this. A painting, as well as other arts, essentially operates on the basis of a background, which they call the universe, a figure, and a shape or contour, which relates the two. So they say the house itself or its equivalent is the finite junction of colored planes, for example. Art, like other disciplines, including philosophy, begins within a framework, which is almost the historical aspect of sensation. They say, art begins not with flesh, but with the house. This is why architecture is the first of the arts. This is also a way to say that art does not begin with sensation, but rather as a composition. What matters the most is that the play between these three aspects of the work of art or of the aesthetic experience defines this passage, this becoming. They say, the flesh, or rather the figure, is no longer the inhabitant of the place of the house, but of the universe that supports the house, becoming. It is like a passage from the finite to the infinite, but also from territory to deterritorialization. It is indeed the moment of the infinite, infinitely varied infinites. This is to say that the plane of composition contains and produces becoming. It is not primarily about representation, that is, what is immediately given, but rather it is about change, something that cannot be represented. This non-representational understanding of art emphasizes zones of indiscernibility, where distinctions like human versus animal, or animate versus inanimate, or even subject versus object dissolve. Deleuze and Guattari provide us with a number of examples: Ahab and the becoming whale, or Van Gogh and the becoming sunflower. But it's important to realize that becoming is not limited to art, or rather, art is not limited to human experience. It is present in all of nature, in some way. So even a creature as insignificant as the tick enters into counterpoint with mammals. One of the most beautiful quotes in all of Deleuze and Guattari, at least in my opinion, is the following, which we are now in a better position to understand. Every morning the Cenopoetes dentri rostris, a bird of the Australian rainforests, cuts leaves, makes them fall to the ground, and turns them over so that the paler internal side contrasts with the earth. In this way it constructs a stage for itself like a ready-made. And directly above, on a creeper or a branch, while fluffing out the feathers beneath its beak to reveal their yellow roots, it sings a complex song made up of its own notes and, at intervals, those of other birds that it imitates. It is a complete artist. This is not synesthesia in the flesh, but blocks of sensation in the territory, colors, postures, and sounds that sketch out a total work of art. So we can see that the plane of composition represents the author's effort to theorize sensation without reducing it to a preconceived organizational scheme, to central faculties, for example. They insist that this plane does not precede the other planes, nor does it follow them. So we can ask, how does the plane of composition relate to the other planes? They say the following. The plane of composition of art and the plane of immanence of philosophy can slip into each other, to the degree that parts of one may be occupied by entities of the other. In fact, in each case, the plane and that which occupies it are like two relatively distinct and heterogeneous parts. A thinker may therefore decisively modify what thinking means, draw up a new image of thought, and institute a new plane of immanence. But instead of creating new concepts that occupy it, they populate it with other instances, with other poetic, novelistic, or even pictorial or musical entities. The opposite is also true. So in the same way that science can derive functions out of philosophical concepts, or that concepts can create the metaphysics of a particular science, art, or aesthetic experience, is what relates the plane of immanence and reference by composing the finite and the infinite together. We have seen that the brain is defined as the junction between the planes of reference, immanence, and composition, the three modes of thought. This junction Deleuze and Guattari define as follows. What defines thought in its three great forms, art, science, and philosophy, is always confronting chaos, laying out a plane, throwing a plane over chaos. But philosophy wants to save the infinite by giving it consistency. It lays out a plane of immanence that, through the action of conceptual personae, takes events or consistent concepts to infinity. Science, on the other hand, relinquishes the infinite in order to gain reference. It lays out a plane of simply undefined coordinates that each time, through the action of partial observers, defines states of affairs, functions, or referential propositions. Art wants to create the finite that restores the infinite. It lays out a plane of composition that, in turn, through the action of aesthetic figures, bears monuments or composite sensations. This is to say that there are essentially three ways to define the brain. The first is in philosophical terms, where the brain is the infinite speeds of thought. The second is in scientific terms, as a finite set of relations between discrete parts. The third one is in artistic terms, as an entity that makes the infinite perceptible within finite compositions. Each of these somehow depends on the others. It's impossible to think an immanent concept without some level of reference or composition. But each of these also nurtures the others. This is how creativity can take place. But ultimately, creation is a double-edged sword, in the sense that it confronts the mind with not just one, but two types of chaos. On the one hand, some basic cognitive rules like resemblance, causality, or contiguity will defend us against chaos by providing some constancy. But on the other hand, these rules can easily be overgeneralized, and this constitutes the realm of opinions, doxa, against which we must also fight. Deleuze and Guattari say, it is as if the struggle against chaos does not take place without an affinity with the enemy, because another struggle develops and takes on more importance, the struggle against opinion, which claims to protect us from chaos itself. Creativity, on which our model of the brain depends, always occurs in between mind and matter, in between objectivity and subjectivity. Creation is ultimately this in-betweenness where percepts, affects, and prospects appear, which reveals perhaps more about the brain than any representation ever could. So Deleuze and Guattari say, if the mental objects of philosophy, art, and science, that is to say vital ideas, have a place, it will be in the deepest of the synaptic fissures, in the hiatuses, intervals, and meantimes of a non-objectifiable brain, in a place where to go in search of them will be to create. So I hope this video helped you understand a little bit of Deleuze and Guattari's definition of the brain. It is a fascinating and complex topic, but hopefully it was good enough to let us understand why the brain is, after all, and without a doubt, the most perfect organ in the universe. For now, I'd like to send a big thank you to all of my patrons, whose contribution I immensely appreciate. Thanks also to all of you for watching, and see you soon.